along to the Pastor's Heart. Dominic Steele is my name. It's great that you could join us again today. And look, today we're talking about the public square, or how do we as Christians engage in the secular world. And it might be in the media, or it might be in social media, or whatever forum. And my guest to help us think that through is Akos Balogh. G'day, mate.
G'day, Dominic. Great to be here.
Great to see you. Akos is the CEO of the Gospel Coalition Australia. And, I think I first came across you, Akos, as a blogger, you know, and thought, this guy's got depth, he's got thoughts, I can learn something from him. But before you were kind of in the blogging, you were the campus director of AFES at Lismore.
Yes.
Tell us about some of the ministry back then, and we'll get to Gospel Coalition in a moment.
Sure. So I started with AFES in 2010 as a campus director there, working with students on campus. It was a great opportunity to spread the gospel and talk to students about the Bible. And so forth. But so I did that for a number of years, from 2010 till 2015.
And now the Gospel Coalition, and you're CEO of Gospel Coalition Australia. What are you guys doing? There's a question to ask the CEO.
Sure. Look, the Gospel Coalition, what we're on about is, firstly, we want to, where appropriate, break down silos between Christians, like-minded Christians, so as to work together more effectively to reach out Australia with the gospel. So that's the bottom line of what we're about. And we do that in a number of different ways. So in a number of different locations within Australia, we've launched some regional chapters aimed at bringing together across the denomination Reformed evangelicals to work together, pray together, support and encourage one another so as to better reach their towns and cities with the gospel. We also want to be an online voice with our website, similar to what TGC USA is. Many people will know those guys. And especially in our changing world, we want to be a strong, committed Christian, Reformed evangelical voice online.
Now, the public square, what is it? What do we mean by that term?
Oh, look, a number of different, ways of answering it. I think for me, it's anywhere outside of our private homes, outside of our private lives. So whenever we're in public with someone, we're talking with other people. It could be obviously in the media, but also locally, at schools and so forth, in the various contexts that we're in. Wherever we're engaging with other people in public, that's basically the public square.
And you've had a line, we need to play defensively in the public square. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, certainly. So I think we need, as Christians, to think about a number of different ways we engage in public. And at the moment, as you would all know, we've got a number of different challenges that we're facing.
It just feels like it's been a wild roller coaster ride. It's been a wild roller coaster ride for 30 years, but it just seems like the last 12 months and the last month, it's just kind of been amped up again. Yeah.
Absolutely. With the release of the findings of the Ruddock Report by Sydney Morning Herald and the outrage that's kicked off, and then recently with the vote that's thankfully got knocked down in Parliament on Monday. Look, it's defensively really is to think about the cultural pressures that we're under and, looking like legal pressures as well down the track, and think, how do we as Christians not only survive but thrive in this environment?
For those engaging with us from overseas, we've just here in Australia had a pretty wild ride, Christians in the public square, the last week here, and it's been particularly on a debate before the Parliament over whether or not really churches, theological colleges and schools that are Christian, that are faith-based institutions, would be actually able and free to continue to teach what they believe. And this obviously has implications for Christian institutions, but also for synagogues, for mosques, people of other faith systems as well.
Basic religious freedom.
Yeah, and it's really been on. Now, how do we play defensively?
Yeah, I think we need to think about a number of things. Firstly, because we're now a minority in our culture, so previously maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, Christianity was fairly much mainstream, at least in terms of our worldview, our ethics, sexual ethics, so forth. That was fairly much accepted across society. But we've obviously seen a massive shift certainly in the last decade, in the last few years it's accelerated, where we are now the minority, not just as Bible-believing Christians, but even just to holding basic sexual ethics, our basic views view of sexuality. And so that puts us under a lot of pressure. And as Christians, I think we need to realise that those pressures can do a lot of damage if we don't defend against them. And the main way to defend against them, or one of the main ways, and I think God gave us the church to be able to gather together, meet together, encourage one another, even as we're pressured from outside culture.
Okay. So what mistakes could we make? And I guess if you're playing defensively, you could see yourself as the victim, you could demonise the opposition.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, certainly one of the mistakes, I guess, if we don't see gathering together as a priority. So this idea that, I'm a Christian, but I don't need to gather regularly with my church, my brothers and sisters, I think that's a real mistake, because at that point you're lending yourself to being vulnerable.
When the tide is flowing so fast in that direction, and I'm just thinking, 2 Timothy 3, I've got to swim against the tide, and
Absolutely.
everything's going wildly against me. And I just got to hang on to the Word and hang on to the people of God.
Yes.
And I'm only going to do that if I meet with them
Yes.
and meet with Him in His Word. Yeah.
Absolutely, and doing that together as well. It's interesting that God didn't give us the Bible and just say, once a week by yourself, read the Bible and pray. He gave us each other, the church, as Hebrews 10:28, I think it is. Don't neglect meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encourage each other. So that's one of the main ways that we need to do it. I mean, there's obviously a lot of dangers, as you mentioned. We can fight fire with fire, as it were, and we can talk about that a bit later in terms of getting outrage, the same way the outrage is pointing towards us. I think that's a real danger. And sadly, I see it online. Sadly, I've seen it in myself as well, in terms of engaging
When
debates.
somebody criticises me, I'm tempted to kind of snap back with the same
Absolutely.
ferocity.
Same ferocity, especially online. Social media is one of those environments where we're kind of put through a sausage machine, and we're sort of all our ability to filter or to be nice to other people, be respectful, is kind of filtered out from us, so that we're just behind a keyboard, the other person is anonymous, and we can just say whatever we want without any repercussion, as it were, or very little repercussion. And that's, I think, the easy trap we fall into when engaging debate online.
One of the temptations, I mean, you just talked about, if you like, being too aggressive, but another temptation might be to avoid conflict at all costs.
Absolutely.
And actually, one of my struggles is I watch a Christian leader bravely decide to take a stand for Jesus, to engage in a conflict situation, whether it's an archbishop or a moderator or one of the various leader people, or even just a well-recognised spokesman. Now, inevitably, they never get it exactly right.
Yeah.
And I mean, we only really watch the Christian debates, but that would be the case in any secular debate. Nobody actually ever gets it exactly right. But what I watch happen is all the other Christians, instead of backing the leader, snipe at them from behind. And you watch this massive, great social media public discussion in front of the non-Christians saying, well, he shouldn't have drawn the line there, that wasn't exactly the right tone. How should me as a keyboard warrior behave when I see a Christian leader take a stand, a courageous stand, but I might not quite agree with them, or I might not quite, because I'm never going to agree with them exactly, because I don't even agree with myself some of the time.
That's right. We look back at things we've said and we think, well, I
could have done it differently.
I could have done it differently. Yeah, I think it's very important to remember that, as you say, the non-Christian world is watching. The non-Christian world is taking notice. And so anything we put out there in public will have repercussions. I think for me personally, unless it's something that is really against what I believe in terms of the gospel, then I'll be very cautious about calling them out for it publicly. I just don't know if there's much benefit in doing that. As a blogger, I might put out a post approaching that same issue from a different angle. We might do that, and the Gospel Coalition Australia as well. But unless someone is not acting in line with the gospel, then I think we just got to be careful about publicly calling them out for it. Yep.
Okay. Talk to me about the whole issue of the changing nature on plausibility structures and beliefs. And even for some of our audience, what do I mean by that term? What do we mean by that?
Yeah, certainly. So a plausibility structure is kind of like social life support for an idea. So For example, in our culture today, every culture has plausibility structures that lend support to the ideas that that culture holds dear. So, for example, today, an obvious one, same-sex marriage, most of the media hold that to be a fundamental human right. And so you see the media is a plausibility structure. They give social life support to the idea that same-sex marriage is a human right. You see that now drifting into other areas, into the corporate world, into sporting groups. I know in Melbourne you have Pride events and so forth around the AFL. And those are, I guess, social support structures which help these ideas gain traction in people's minds. And I think the thing we need to understand about plausibility structure is most of the ideas we hold dear ourselves. It's not like someone gives it to us on a platter, we think through it from all angles and then say to ourselves, are we going to accept this, are we going to reject this? Most of our ideas we gain through osmosis, through these plausibility structures. So for example...
Rather than having carefully thought out the principles behind them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so you'll see the shift that's taken place in society, again, talking about same-sex marriage, is that most people haven't had a deep, in-depth discussion or thought about what same-sex marriage is or what the implications are. They've just seen the plausibility structures, the media, the commentariat, people they hold in high regard, accepting it, and therefore they themselves accept it as well. Yeah.
Right. How then do I respond to that? As a pastor, as a leader, leading the flock that God has given me.
Yeah, sure. I think as a pastor you need to remember that your own church is a plausibility structure. And so making sure that within your own church, particularly if there are ideas in the outside world that are corroding Christians' confidence, such as ideas about sexuality, then within your own church, you're giving the biblical ideas plausibility by teaching on them, by modelling them well, by ensuring that other key leaders in your church teach and model them well. And it's in that way that we can give biblical ideas plausibility. I think that's the most important thing we can do.
So the accusation comes that Christians are obsessed with sex because they're talking about it all the time. And now, on one hand, I don't want to be that guy, but on the other hand, you're saying I do need to be teaching on that subject, particularly because it's where we're out of step with the society at the moment, and so therefore, because it's an out of step point, I need to be teaching on it more.
Absolutely, particularly for young people. I mean, this is what they're experiencing. My daughter's in primary school, she's in year 5, and already her friends are teasing her about same-sex marriage. So my daughter identifies as a Christian, and somehow same-sex marriage came up. She said, look, she believes marriage is between a man and a woman, and her friends started teasing her about it. So it's happening in schools, universities, whether we like it or not. And so this is an opportunity. And I'm not saying you need to always teach on it, of course, but there needs to be times throughout the year where these topics come up and are discussed.
Where there's a robust teaching on the goodness of God's plan for marriage and sexuality.
That's right. So our culture gives a very compelling story to people about the sexual ethics that our culture holds dear today, about same-sex marriage, about the sexual revolution, how that's a good thing, that's a freeing thing from the oppression of church and tradition. So that's the narrative people are being taught in our culture, and so we need to give a better story. So Glyn Harrison, an author, he talks about his book is called A Better Story About Human Sexuality. He says we need to actually present God's view of sexuality, ideally in a narrative form that captures people's hearts and minds, and show why it's not just different from what our culture believes, but better as well.
Now, help me on the difference between what you've just said is God's way of life is better than the non-Christian's way of life.
Yes.
Now, okay, I'm saying, right, that's a good point. And it makes sense. Life will go better in the Creator's world if I live the Creator's way. Do you know? And so, in the end, if I live the Creator's way, I'm likely to be happier. If I've only got one sexual partner for 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, I'm likely to be wealthier. Do you know, now, what's different to what I've just said to the prosperity gospel?
I think we can say to our culture that our actions have consequences, particularly for the most vulnerable. And so when it comes to something like the sexual revolution, I think what we can do is to point out the consequences of the sexual revolution's beliefs and actions. Like, where does the sexual revolution's teachings end up?
Yeah, loneliness.
Loneliness, absolutely. Broken families, particularly if you look at the statistics.
Unstable kids.
Rising anxiety amongst kids.
Whereas if you have a secure family unit, it will go better. Now here's my angst though. I'm just thinking.
Sure.
I used to argue in modernity for truth. Then in post-modernity, well, nobody had a truth, and so. What am I saying? I've got a relationship with God, and it makes a difference to me. Now, in post-modernity, I'm running to pragmatism. Do you know? I mean, sorry, I'm saying me, Dominic. I'm saying the world's thinking is running to pragmatism, and you've just said, say this is better.
Yes.
You know. Now, I think I'm just playing with the idea. I've got to preach the gospel to say I've got to say this is a better way to live.
Yes.
But I've also got to say, I'm not just arguing because it's better.
Yep.
I'm arguing it because of the past, the cross, the resurrection,
yes.
and the future,
yes.
the coming judgment,
yes.
and eternal life and eternal judgment. And so I am saying it because of the present,
yes.
but I'm also saying it because of the past and the future. You know, do you want to come back at me on that?
Sure. Look, I think when we show that the Christian way of life in all areas, in terms of relationships, sexually, in marriage and so forth, if we can show to people, and I don't think it's hard, if we can show to people that there are better outcomes for people when they live that way, whether they're Christian or not, I think what that does, it opens up opportunities to talk then about the gospel, especially in a culture now where there's so much hostility, where the dominant narrative is more and more that religion, Christianity in particular, is a force for evil. If we can say to them, look, well, this is what's happened with the sexual revolution, but if you live according to the God's design, this is what happens to people, there's much more human flourishing, then I think that opens up doors to actually share the gospel. Because I think people need to be convinced that the Christianity is good before they'll be convinced, or humanly speaking, they need to be shown that Christianity is good before they'll then try and engage with whether Christianity is true.
Okay, let me just play with you on that idea. Yep. You just dropped the sentence, somebody might say Christianity is evil. So I'll be the non-Christian, you can be the Christian.
Sure.
Akos, you're a Christian, Christianity is dangerous, Christianity is evil. Role play it with me.
And at this point, I'd say, what do you mean by that? What are your underlying beliefs about that?
I'm just concerned that it just seems like the church is against love, and I believe in love.
Sure. And at this point, I'd want to dig deeper and take the conversation upstream, and I'd say, how did you come to that conclusion? What makes you say that?
How did I come to the conclusion I believe in love?
No, that the church is against love.
Against same-sex marriage,
okay.
You know, and there's been all these incidents of, particularly the Catholic Church, not properly looking after children. Yeah, I would hope that the institutional leaders in our country really did look after children well. Yeah.
And I guess what I'd say to that is I think that's where we can find common ground, because as a Christian I find that horrifying as well, that the institutional leadership of churches did those things to children. I think that is horrifying. As a Christian I find it horrifying, and I think more importantly I think the Jesus of the New Testament, the Bible, would see it as horrifying as well. So if we had a look at what Jesus actually said about children, about caring for others, the most vulnerable, he'd be horrified to hear that, as a Christian I believe he knows, but he's horrified to see that sort of thing happening.
So his followers have not acted rightly.
That's right. So I think the issue here is that Jesus has taught us how to live, in particular how to look after children, but his followers, certain institutional church leaders and certain Christians haven't followed his teaching, which is very clear, and I'd be happy to sit down with you and open it up and we can look at it. But the issue I think there is that they haven't actually followed Jesus' clear teaching on this.
Okay. Posture of grace. How do we do a posture of grace in these debates, online debates, and I guess, the social media ones, but the bigger ones, the where you're a leader taking a stand, whether it's a church leader in your community, a church leader going to talk to a local politician,
Sure.
or a church leader. We'd have a lot of people who are ministers in country towns who might write an article in the newspaper.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think, the go-to passages like 1 Peter 3:15, which talk about defending our faith with gentleness and respect, I think they're the sorts of ways that we need to be speaking, whether online or whether in the newspaper. And so that means things like that we don't speak in outrageous tones, where we don't use the same level of outrage and anger particularly directed at people. So we don't use the ad hominem arguments of attacking people's character, attacking people directly, but we try and stick with the actual issue that we're talking about, whatever it might be. So I think that's a key thing.
I'm just saying repay evil with blessing. Do you know that
right.
really comes straight out of that verse, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't repay evil with evil or insult with insult. And I think that's a good one to stick by your computer when you're on social media. A posture of grace, I think, will also remember that what we're after is ultimately to win the person, not to win the argument. And so we want to be gracious towards other people, because I think the New Testament would lend itself to saying, such as in 1 Peter 2:12, that the way we live our lives will potentially open up doors to the gospel. And so we want to live our lives in a way that is gracious and which helps people to remove barriers from looking at Jesus. I think most people would see Christians these days, well, not most people, but a lot of people would see Christians these days as judgmental, arrogant, bigoted. And if you can be gracious in conversation towards other people by actually, firstly, listening to what they've got to say, not attacking them, assuming the best when you're talking with them, I think that does a lot in terms of breaking down people's misconceptions.
And I actually think that's the case in terms of the non-Christian might have the perception that the Christian church as a whole is kind of like this, but the actual experience of their local church is totally different because there have been personal interactions of generosity, of kindness, of the playgroup's been really nice, the people, the host people at the playgroup have been lovely, they've cared for me, they've cooked meals for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about, I've heard you say a line about social media debates, whoever has the last word loses. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think in social media debates, particularly where it's a long one, where it's a long debate that you're having with someone, the temptation is to always have the last word. The temptation, I guess, put in another way, is to try and win. And I think that is, I don't think that's a posture of grace. That's more a posture of I want to win almost at all costs. And so I think there's something to be said by listening to the other person, having your say, but if at the end of the day, especially on social media, you haven't convinced them, then I think be gracious, let them have the last say, and leave it at that.
Okay. I guess also in the social media debate, there's the person you're talking to who probably is a polar opposite view to you and you, but you're actually playing for the middle 80%. Do you know, how does that work?
Yeah, I think it's a realisation that people are looking over your shoulder and seeing what you're saying and seeing how you're saying it. So there's been a few conversations where that I've been in where people have come up to me afterwards and said, look, you know, I appreciate the way you engaged this debate. Not that I do it all the time well, but there have been a few instances where I've held my tongue in check, where I've let the other person have the last say, and then people have private messaged me and said, look, thanks for the way you engaged this debate.
I'm just thinking, I think I've been reticent to, as a Christian leader, with a reasonably large Facebook friend list, to get involved in public social media debates because I think maybe a third of my friend list on social media are non-Christians, and do I want to take all of their attention over to this squabble, you know? And so so I've held back from it, whereas and made my posture on Facebook particularly to be one of commending Jesus, commending this church. Now, and then I've engaged in conflict and argument in both in the forum of the auditorium here at church, perhaps in the pastor's heart, in blogs and those kind of things. But I'm wondering whether or not you want to say, no, Dominic, you need to be more on the front foot.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a wisdom issue. I think it depends on what the issue is and whether social media is an ideal place to address those issues. Look, in general, I think social media is very volatile. I think it's not the ideal place to have an argument with someone. As much as I think there is a place for debate, I think it's a limited place. And what you're saying in terms of actually doing it live with people here at the auditorium, I think that's actually a lot better. So I think as a general rule, we want to, if we're debating someone, we'd want to move the debate offline, face-to-face, so we can actually have a conversation with them. I think that's the ideal. Obviously, that's not always possible. But again, it depends. I wonder if it's a case in social media for me as I think about my social media engagement. I think part of it is trying to move those conversations upstream, trying to ask questions of people that I'm debating against. Because often most people, getting back to plausibility structures, most people have beliefs about the world, not because they've thought through them deeply, but because they've just absorbed them from their culture. And so if you could just ask a few questions to help them, what do you mean by that? Can you clarify what you're meaning? And how did you come to that conclusion? Like, what's the basis for your belief about whatever it is? Often people will come back to me and say, okay, yeah, I'm not quite sure. It's just something I think to be true. So I think the social media is best for asking those sorts of questions.
I remember one guy, young bloke, in Introducing God, saying, he was probably night 4 or 5 or 6 of Introducing God, and he said, well, I'm not sure that the Christian worldview is true yet, but I know that my worldview is not stacking up. And so I've either got to take this one or I've got to find a better one.
Absolutely.
But by doing the several weeks of discussion on Introducing God, he'd worked out that he'd been exposed in the discussion to all the inconsistencies in his own framework of belief that really was just a hodgepodge. Yeah. I watched you go back and forward on an interaction a little with John Dixon on the issue of losing well as a Christian in the public square. What did you mean by that? Do you know? Yeah.
Oh, look, I wrote a blog post after listening to one of John's podcasts and just tried to clarify with him what he meant by the term losing well in the public square. Now, look, as it turns out, I think I agree with what he said. But it was more a case of, in the public square, if Christians are opposition, like, I guess I thought to myself, what I understood him initially to be saying is that if there's opposition in the public square and Christians are booted out, then losing well means just to accept being booted out. And I thought to myself, okay, if that's what he means, then I have a few questions around that. Now, as it turns out, what he means was similar to what we talked about in terms of when we're insulted, don't repay evil for evil, but with a blessing. And we should still engage with the public square, which is what he does with things like CPX and so forth. So for me, I guess where I've landed with all this is that as Christians, we need to be gracious advocates in the public square. We think back to people like the Martin Luther King Jr., whatever concerns we might have about various aspects of his theology, I think his method of public engagement was, well, we're booted out of the public square, but this is a real justice issue that affects the lives of millions of people, and we want to actually address this in what he would argue to be a Christian way. We want to stand up for justice for the sake of the most vulnerable. And I think as Christians here in this country, if we have a vote, if we're citizens, then we have a voice. And I think rather than withdrawing from the public square, and again, I'm not saying this is what John or anyone else is saying, but as a Christian, I think we shouldn't withdraw from the public square. We should use our voice to try and influence the laws of the land so they align with the Christian worldview.
Which is actually going to be a blessing to the country in the end.
That's right, because it's not just Christians that are going to be affected by it, it's also non-Christians. So you look at things like gender fluidity in schools. It's not just the Christian students that are going to find that difficult to deal with. It's also non-Christian students. You look at other examples throughout history. So I came from a communist country, a bit of an extreme example. I was born in a communist country. Most of the people that were persecuted under communism were non-Christians. And many atheist commentators have pointed out, such as Chris Berg, he's a political commentator, that most of the values that even secular Aussies hold dear, equality, rule of law, justice, our idea of justice. They
in the end come from the gospel.
In the end, come from Christian roots. Because the other thing we need to understand, there is no such thing as secular neutral morality. There's not like a secular neutral morality that rules the public square. The public square, to use a phrase that I heard somewhere, is a battleground of gods. It's a battleground of different worldviews. And so at the moment, there's all these worldviews vying for attention in the public square, and they'll be whatever worldview becomes dominant is what drives our laws and what drives public policy. And so what we want, I think, as Christians is to say, hey, I think the Christian worldview should be in there, driving laws about things like euthanasia, things like what it means to be a human being, gender and so forth. Because I think that way of living, the Christian worldview, is actually a just way of living in this world.
Akos, thanks very much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Akos Balogh has been my guest on The Pastor's Heart this week. Akos, of course, is the Chief Executive Officer of the Gospel Coalition Australia. And it's been great to have you join us on The Pastor's Heart this week, and we'll look forward to catching up with you next week.